Hello everyone. Today we will be discussing about ATP and ADP. ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate and is the energy used by an organism in its daily operations. It consists of an adenosine molecule and three organic phosphates. After a simple reaction breaking down ATP to ADP, the energy released from the breaking of a molecular ATP contains three phosphates, and when it is converted to adenosine diphosphate or ADP, a phosphate is removed and energy is released that cell can use for processes like movement, synthesis, and active transport. Cells use ATP continuously, so after it is broken down, it needs to be put back together. Think of it as the energy currency of the cell. If a cell needs to spend energy to accomplish a task, the ATP molecule splits one of its three phosphates, becoming ADP, adenosine diphosphate, plus phosphate. The energy holding that phosphate molecule is now released and available to do work for the cell. Most of the ATP in cells is produced by the enzyme ATP synthase, which converts ADP and phosphate to ATP. The ATP synthase is located in the membrane of cellular structures called mitochondria. In plant cells, the enzyme also is found in chloroplasts.
ATP to ADP energy release. This is done by a simple process in which one of the two phosphate molecules is broken off, therefore reducing the ATP from 3 phosphates to 2, forming ADP or adenosine diphosphate after removing one of the phosphates. This is commonly written as ADP plus PI. When the bond connecting the phosphate is broken, energy is released, and the energy is called hydrolysis. When one phosphate group is removed by breaking up phosphoanhydride bond in a process, and ATP is converted to adenosine diphosphate or ADP.
While ATP is constantly being used up by the body in its biological processes, the energy supply can be bolstered by new sources of glucose being made available via eating food, which is then broken down by the digestive system to smaller particles that can be utilized by the body. And on top of this, ADP is built back up into ATP so that it can be used again in its more energetic state. Although this conversion requires energy, the process produces a net gain in energy, meaning that more energy is available by reusing ADP plus pi back into ATP. Because ATP plays a critical role in the transport of macromolecules such as proteins and lipids into and out of the cell. The hydrolysis of ATP provides the required energy for active transport mechanism to carry such molecules across a concentration gradient.
Glucose and ATP. Many ATP are needed every second by a cell. So ATP is created inside them due to the demand. The fact that organisms like ourselves are made up of millions of cells. Glucose, a sugar that is delivered via the bloodstream, is the product of the food you eat. And this is the molecule that is used to create ATP. Sweet foods provide a rich sources of readily available glucose, while other foods provide the materials needed to create glucose.
Many ATP are needed every second by a cell, so ATP is created inside them due to the demand, and the fact that organisms like ourselves are made up of millions of cells. Glucose, a sugar that is delivered via the bloodstream, is the product of the food you eat, and this is the molecule that is used to create ATP. Sweet foods provide a rich source of readily available glucose, while other foods provide the materials needed to create glucose. Energy is needed at the start of glycolysis to split the glucose molecule into pyruvate molecules. These two molecules go on stage 2 of cellular respiration. The energy to split glucose is provided by two molecules of ATP.
This glucose is broken down in a series of enzyme-controlled steps that allow the release of energy to be used by organism. This process is called respiration. Glucose respiration, ATP, ATP cycle, ADP plus P, energy.
Respiration and creation of ATP. ATP is created by a respiration in both animals and plants. The difference with plants is the fact that they attain their food from elsewhere. See photosynthesis.
In essence, materials are harnessed to create ATP for biological processes. The energy can be created by cellular respiration. The process of respiration occurs in three steps. When oxygen is present,
Glycolysis is the first stage of cellular respiration. It takes it takes place in the cytoplasm of the cell. The word glycolysis means glucose splitting. That's exactly what happens in this stage. Enzymes split a molecules of glucose into two smaller molecules called pyruvate. This result this result in a net gain of two molecules of ATP. Other energy Other energy storing molecules are also produced. Their energy will be used in stage 3 to make more ATP. Glycolysis Glycolysis does not require oxygen. Anything that doesn't need oxygen is described as anaerobic. And this is my explanation. Isang isang metabolic process na pumipigil sa carbohydrate at sugar sa pamamagitan ng isang serye ng mga reaksyon sa alinman ng pyruvic acid o lactic acid at naglalabas ng enerhiya para sa katawan sa anyo ng ATP.
Stage 2, the Krebs cycle. During this stage, two more molecules of ATP are produced. Other energy storing molecules are also produced to be used to make more ATP in stage 3. The Krebs cycle requires oxygen. Anything that needs oxygen is described as aerobic. The oxygen combines with carbon from the pyruvate molecules. This form carbon dioxide, a waste product. The Krebs cycle, also called the citric acid cycle, is the second major step in oxidative phosphorylation. After glucose breaks glucose into smaller 3-carbon molecules, the Krebs cycle transfers the energy from these molecules to electron carriers. which will be used in electron transport chain to produce ATP.
Cytochrome C is primarily known for its function in the mitochondria as a key participant in the life-supporting function of ATP synthesis. However, when a cell receives an apoptotic stimulus, cytochrome C is released into the cytosol and triggers programmed cell death through apoptosis. It states that cytochrome C is primarily known for continuing the function of mitochondria, which in turn supports ATP synthesis. However, it also helps in declaring which cells may be lost or die due to its excessive sign in our body. The release of cytochrome C and cytochrome C-mediated apoptosis are controlled by multiple layers of regulations, the most prominent layers being members of the B-cell lipoma protein 2 BCL2 family, as well as its role in canonical intrinsic apoptosis. Cytochrome C amplifies signals that are generated by other apoptotic pathways and participates in certain non-apoptotic functions. The release of cytochrome C and cytochrome C-mediated apoptosis are controlled by multiple layers of regulations, the most prominent layers being members of the B-cell lipoma protein 2 BCL2 family, as well as its role in canonical intrinsic apoptosis. Cytochrome C amplifies signals that are generated by other apoptotic pathways and participates in certain non-apoptotic functions. The release of cytochrome C and cytochrome C-mediated apoptosis controls many layers, the best known of which is the B-cell lipoma protein 2 BCL2 family, which we know that when you have B-cell lipoma, then your body makes too many abnormal or incorrect cells in our body, which causes us to no longer properly fight the infections we have in our body. As well as the canonical intrinsic cilia also signals the passages that participate in non-apoptotic functions.
Why the body needs food. Your metabolism is the collection of chemical reactions that occur in your cells to sustain life. Some to these reactions use stored energy to build things up, which we call anabolism, while other reactions break things down, releasing energy that can be stored for future use, and this is called catabolism.
Imagine that a hamburger you're having for dinner, made of proteins, fat, and carbohydrates, is a collection of Lego blocks of various colors and shapes. It took a lot of energy to organize those blocks into that complex structure, and breaking of blocks apart releases that energy and frees the blocks so that they can be built up into a new things. Your body does exactly what when you eat your food. Living things break down the three major categories of food: proteins, fats, and carbohydrates, into their constituent parts, the individual Lego blocks, for two reasons. 1. Once the food atoms and groups of atoms molecules are broken down, they can be built back into the specific kind of things the organism needs, like bones, muscles, skins, hair, feathers, fur, bark, leaves, etc.
Breaking down the food molecules releases the energy that was holding them together, and that released energy is temporarily stored by the cells for the rebuilding process. Each of these food types regard a different breakdown process, and we'll look at those later, but the goal is the same: take the energy that held those food molecules together and release it so that it can be stored, a form that the cells can use later to build what it needs. The cell has a special kind of the molecules for storing that energy, and it's called ATP.
ATP, adenosine triphosphate, is an important molecule found in the living things. Think of it as the energy currency of the cell. If a cell needs to spend energy to accomplish a task, the ATP molecule splits off one of its three phosphates become ADP, adenosine diphosphate. Phosphate, the energy holding that phosphate molecules is now releasing and available to do work for the cell.
When the cell has extra energy gained from breaking down the food that has been consumed, or in the case of plants made via photosynthesis, it stores the energy by reattaching a free phosphate molecule to ADP, turning it back into ATP. The ATP molecule is just like a rechargeable battery. When it's fully charged, it's ATP. When it's run down, it's ADP. However, the battery doesn't thrown away when it's run down. It just gets charged up again. Here's what it looks like chemically. Each phosphate is a PO4. Oxygen has a charge of -2, and there are four of them, for a total of -8, and P has a charge of +5. So the net charge of phosphate group is -3. If free H atoms, which are +5, get added to the zero atoms that aren't bonded to two things, then the net charge is 0.
There are times when the cells need even more energy and it splits off another phosphate, so it goes from ADP adenosine diphosphate to AMP, adenosine monophosphate. ADP and AMP. ADP is adenosine diphosphate and AMP is adenosine monophosphate.
There are other energy storage molecules in the cell, like NAD and FAD, but the ATP system is the most common and the most important. Think of the others as different brands of rechargeable batteries that do the same job. Next, we'll explore some of the pathways that the body uses to break down food of different types. What about oxygen? Why do we need that? What happens if you put a glass over a candle? You start the fire of oxygen and the flame flickers out. If a metabolic reaction is aerobic, it requires oxygen. But why? Here's an analogy. Think about lighting a campfire. What do you need? You need fuel, the wood. You need heat. It's harder to light a fire when it's cold. And you need oxygen. Because another word for burning is oxidizing. And as you might guess, it can only occur in the presence of oxygen. Oxidizing something causes it to lose electrons, which means that energy, the electrons, is released when you oxidize or burn a fuel. Your food is your fuel. You burn the fuel for energy. You need the oxygen to burn the fuel. This happens in the mitochondria.
Here are some questions, and the first is what about oxygen, the second is why do we need that, and the last is what happens if you put a glass over a candle. Here's an analogy. If you starve the fire of oxygen and the flame flickers out, if a metabolic reaction is aerobic, it requires oxygen. But why? Here's an analogy. Think about lighting a campfire. What do you need? You need fuel or the wood. You need heat. It's harder to light a fire when it's cold. And you need oxygen because another word for burning is oxidizing. And as you might guess it, can only occur in the presence of oxygens. Oxidizing something causes it to lose electrons, which means that energy or the so-called electrons is released when you oxidize or burn a fuel. Your food is your fuel. You burn the fuel for energy. You need the oxygen to burn the fuel. This happens in the mitochondria.